Thank you, Chair. We're live streaming on YouTube, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Good evening. Good evening and welcome to East Devon District Council's virtual consultative scrutiny meeting on the 29th of July 2021. I am your chair, Councillor Tom Wright. I would especially welcome Alistair Bruce, our newly elected district councillor, who's here on his first scrutiny meeting, and I hope he feels able to contribute as much as he wishes. In fact, I hope we can all contribute as much as we wish. I would also like to welcome anyone watching the meeting via the live streaming. Following the emergency general meeting of council on the 26th of July, I would like to remind members and any members of the public attending or watching that the council has delegated much of the decision making to senior officers. Well, not decision making, shall we say decision taking to officers. This is due for the short period of time due to concerns about COVID. Consequently, this will be a consultative meeting only. We will adhere as much as possible to the procedural rules detailed in the Constitution. Accordingly, where the meeting would have normally decided a matter, then this will now be a recommendation to the senior officer who was taking the decision, so that the officer will have regard to the views expressed when taking that decision. Where the meeting is making onward recommendations, i.e. to council, cabinet or another committee, this will happen in the normal way. All participants here today are taking part remotely, and as well as being live streamed, the meeting is being recorded. So please bear this in mind throughout, and may I remind you to be careful with your language. May I also remind members that the Code of Conduct applies throughout this meeting. We also reserve the right to remove and disconnect any participant who is disrupting the meeting by whatever means. Please turn any telephone devices off or onto silent. As this consultative scrutiny committee meeting is dependent on internet connection and a power supply, in the event of a break in the internet connection or power cut, please bear with us as we try to reconnect. After 15 minutes, if we are not able to reconnect, we will consider the meeting adjourned and reconvene at a later date. Please check the committee page on our website for details. Please make sure all microphones are muted when you are not speaking to avoid any background noise levels. Keep points short, and please do not repeat points that have already been made, and do not interrupt. If you wish to comment, please raise your electronic hand and wait to be called. I will add there that as this is my first meeting as chair, I will be relying very much on our excellent democratic services officers to keep me in line and not overlook anyone. But please bear, you might not be called in the order that you necessarily think you should be called in, but I assure you everyone will be given an opportunity to talk. All councillors have been sent the agenda for today's meeting. Any members of the public who want to view the agenda can do so by visiting our website, www.eastdevon.gov.uk. We will now start the meeting by doing a roll call of committee members here present. Can you please now unmute your mics, and when you hear your name, please confirm by saying present. When you have confirmed you are present, please make sure your microphone is muted again. Thank you. I'll now ask Sarah to do the roll call of committee members.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Allen.
Yes, I'm here, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bruce.
He's gone black.
He's muted. Councillor Bruce. I'll come back to Councillor Bruce. Councillor Chapman.
Present, Sarah.
Thank you. Councillor Davey.
Present, thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Councillor Gardner. No.
I think she's sending apologies.
Oh, thank you very much. Councillor Johns.
Present, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Councillor Miller.
Present, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Parr.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Pepper. No, I don't think Councillor Pepper's here. Councillor Ranger.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Rylance.
Present.
Thank you. And Councillor Wright.
Present, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Can I just come back to Councillor Bruce, please? I think he's in the meeting, but I think he's muted and possibly having internet problems. But the meeting is quorate. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Can I just check? Is Councillor Hawkins? He's on my list, is he?
He's given apologies.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Item 1, public speaking. I understand there are no members of the public who've expressed a wish to speak. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. So now go on to item 2, which is minutes of the previous meeting, pages 3 to 8. If anyone has a comment on the set of minutes from the 8th of April, please do this by raising your electronic hand. If I have no hands raised, I will take this as an indication that you are happy to recommend the minutes for approval. I see no hands raised, so I will recommend those minutes for approval. Thank you. Item 3 is apologies.
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Councillor Coleman, Councillor Hawkins and Councillor Gardner.
Thank you. Agenda item 4, declarations of interest. When your name is called, please state your declaration, including which agenda item your declaration relates to. If it is a personal or a prejudicial declaration, and state what exactly that interest is, please. Sarah, would you do the roll call and ask for declaration? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Allen.
None, Sarah. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Bruce.
None, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Chapman.
None, Sarah.
Thank you. Councillor Davey.
Only that I'm a member of Exmouth Town Council, which possibly impacts on some of the enforcement issues, planning enforcement, but I can't really think that it's particularly relevant.
Thank you. And that would be a personal interest. Thank you. Councillor Johns.
Only item 8, which I think personally affects all councillors, if it's staff morale, but it's a personal interest, not a pecuniary interest.
Thank you. Councillor Miller.
None, thank you, Chair. Sarah, sorry.
Thank you. Councillor Parr.
None, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ranger.
None, thank you.
Councillor Rylance.
None, thanks.
And Councillor Wright.
None, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Agenda item 5, matters of urgency. I have not been informed of any such matters. Thank you. Agenda item 6, confidential exempt items. There are no confidential exempt items which officers recommend should be dealt with in this way. Agenda item 7, decisions made by Cabinet, including portfolio holders, called in by members for scrutiny in accordance with the overview and scrutiny procedure rules. There are no items to consider. Agenda item 8 is a report on proposed actions to improve staff morale, and those are at pages 9 to 21. And I will call on the Chief Executive, Mark Williams, to introduce this item. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Chair. So taking you to page 9 on the agenda papers, this is my follow-up report to the report that came before the committee in March of this year. And you'll hopefully recall that at that meeting, I did indicate that strategic leads and service leads would be working on action plans to look in more detail at the results of the staff survey. Those action plans have been prepared, and there's a summary in the schedule to the report of the issues that arise from those action plans and the suggested actions that we're working on to try and address those issues. So I'd invite you to consider this as an update report. It does reflect work in progress. And as I also mentioned in the report, some of the topics have already been the subject of reports to Cabinet in some areas dealing with capacity issues. There's also reports that are, or certainly a report that's in the course of preparation for the new Personnel Committee, which is scheduled to have its first meeting in September this year. So that was an initiative that took place at the annual meeting, and obviously before the annual meeting we didn't have that committee. So I'm not too sure how much detail you want me to go into at this stage. Perhaps if I take you past part one or section one of the report, the background you will have seen before. The only thing I've added is a note at the end of paragraph 1.1, which is that we are due a follow-up review from the LGA peer review team, and they will assess and comment on what has transpired, what has happened with the council since they last visited us. But that's a part. The other elements of section one are what you've already seen, and then I come on to section two. And I give you a bit more detail about just how the action plans have been prepared and the issues that they are designed to address. And in respect of the Health and Safety Executive Survey that we undertook, it is quite structured. So the questions that were asked were in relation to the previous 6 months of staff's experience of working for the council. So the survey was carried out in February this year, so it reflected on the previous 6 months to February of this year. And then the questions are analysed according to sort of acknowledged stress factors that impact upon morale and other issues. And you can see at the bottom of page 11, those are demand, change, control, management support, peer support, relationships, and role. And in sort of a brief conclusion, on page 12, you can see that control, management support and peer support were significant in terms of some of the concerns that staff have raised. And then there were some common themes, if you like, in terms of repeated suggested actions. And I've highlighted those with the last 3 bullet points on page 12. So taking you on to page 13, where I set out the analysis of the demands aspect of the stress factors. You can see that the table's in 3 parts. The first column looks at the services that did respond under demand. There's a summary of the issues that were raised by the services, and then there's a sort of a summary of the suggested actions. And as I already suggested, those suggested actions are work in progress. Because it's quite a complex picture, there won't just be one action, one report, or one decision that will deal with everything. It will be an ongoing process whereby we address all those actions. The intention being that we can then carry out a further survey in October or November of this year, and then, depending on those survey results, we can reflect on where there's been successful resolution to some of the issues raised, and maybe where there may still need to be some work prepared or work done to address issues that still need attention, or indeed any new ones that may have arisen when we do the second survey. So very, very happy to answer any questions, very, very happy to go into more detail on any of the issues or the suggested actions that are set out on pages 13 and following, but hopefully that's sufficient by way of a brief introduction, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. One question that I would immediately like to ask is, when is this review that we referred to in your opening sort of comment to take place?
Well, I have a meeting scheduled for, I think it's mid-September, with local government association officers, where we will then discuss the programming for that follow-up review. And in terms of timetabling, I guess if you look at some of the different initiatives that are currently being worked on, obviously, we've got the Personnel Committee. There'll be a meeting of the Personnel Committee in September. There's currently an independent learning review that is underway, which Council requested or required, and that's being carried out by the East of England Employers Association. That's due to report sort of mid-September time, and that will then be for councils to consider. There's also other work underway involving the South West Local Government Association and a facilitator that they've recommended to the council. Then we'll have the further survey, as I say, in October, November time. So my sense would be that possibly December, maybe January next year would be the earliest when the LGA would think it's appropriate to carry out a follow-up review. Some of it depends on their own schedule of work, how many more councils that they're visiting, and also the availability of officers and members who, as you know, form part of those peer review teams. But that's the sort of timetabling and scheduling, if you like, that I've got in my mind. You're on mute, Chair.
New to the game. I'm anxious that members who want to ask you questions do ask you questions now before we go into general debate. But I'd like those questions to be very much targeted at what is in the report, to see, the whole object of this exercise is to improve staff morale going forward. It's not a time when we should be, I think we should be looking over to see what has happened in the past. So would you please, when you ask your question, frame your question with a view to eliciting what will be done, how we will be improving things for our staff. So I'll now very much in the hands of our democratic services officers to call to let me know who's next.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Allen first, followed by Councillor Davey.
Thank you. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Could we just look at page 19 of the report and the top section? And I just wanted to ask Mark a couple of things there, and then another question on page 20. Obviously, there are issues in terms of member officer communication. And there's a proposal there to revise the member officer protocol and for leading members to stop creating a blame culture and bullying. And my concern there is that the EDA have apologised as a group for their particular role. Apparently, East Devon Alliance have done so, not Devon Alliance. But I want to know how the next stage of the process will take place to ensure that members and officers not only don't have friction, but also have freedom to interact for the best benefit of the local residents of East Devon. So I wonder if Mark could lay out some mechanisms forward for that particular area. Now, do you want to answer that? And I'll come back on the question on page 20, or would you particularly think it would be appropriate, Mark, to look at the issue of consider reinstating member champions as part of the answer? Thank you very much.
Okay. So if we start with your question regarding relationships and the suggested actions that are there. In terms of the member officer protocol, that is something that will be reviewed. It's a piece of work that Henry has in his work plan. And if you pull up the report to Cabinet, not last night's Cabinet, but the Cabinet before, then there is a report on that agenda which sort of highlights some of the steps that are requested by Cabinet to be taken, and the member officer protocol is part of that. Beyond that, I think the issue is twofold, really. One is working with individual members where some assistance or clarification may be required in terms of how best to fulfill the role of councillor, if you like. And the second part, I think, relates to the statement, stroke apology that Councillor Loudon made at Cabinet. So that was made on behalf of the Democratic Alliance Group, and was very full, I think, in terms of the matters it addressed and the apology that it contained. And I think of significance too was the response that Unison sent to all councillors in acknowledgement, if you like, of the fact, really, that statement, was essentially, it had to be made in order to sort of help us take the first step to move on, if you like. There is further work, I know, that came out of my report to the previous Cabinet around working with other groups, and that's again something that will be part of our work plan going forward. But hopefully that sort of answers your question with regard to that. The member champion aspect, that was something in particular, if you look at the top of page 20, that came through from the planning and development team, and ironically, perhaps, whereas some teams were raising concerns about the level of member engagement or involvement, in fact, in the area of member champions, the planning and development team had identified that actually the ability to relate to an individual councillor, perhaps, who would then take on ownership of championing an aspect of the planning service, whether it be trees, conservation areas, neighbourhood plans, for example, to think of three. Actually, the ability to have a point of contact, a point of focus as a member champion would, in fact, perhaps help signpost or guide other members to a councillor to sort of help with that aspect, rather than necessarily fielding multiple queries from councillors on potentially the same related aspect, really. So I hope that answers your questions, councillor.
Yes, thank you, Mark.
Yeah, Councillor Davey, I think that's next. Over to you, Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thanks for this report, Mark. It's very helpful, and I think it begins to show that we are starting to look at some of the issues. And I don't want to dwell on what the Democratic Alliance have done, but I just want to say that there have been some very honest conversations among our group, and quite a lot of soul searching, I think. And I think we are certainly ready to move forward. But I wanted to really ask, but it seems to me there's a couple of issues here that could be addressed fairly simply and easily. Having said that, I look at them and think maybe not. But one is the staffing issue, and I know we've seen the problems Street Scene have had recently. I think we're all aware of those, and I really feel for the teams there, because it must be horrible feeling that you haven't managed to pick up people's recycling and so on, and we know how quick people are to complain when that doesn't happen, and that is a significant stress factor, as I know myself. I'm just wondering, there seem to be a couple of little comments here, like the recruitment process is often delayed and takes too long. And I wonder just if you could outline maybe what we're doing to speed up recruitment and perhaps ensure that we have sufficient staff and the right qualifications to move forward. We do seem to be having a few problems getting staff with the requisite qualifications as well. And the other issue that it seemed to me could be addressed, I would have hoped fairly quickly, is the IT issue. Certainly I'm aware that when staff are using the global desktop, it just, the sound quality is not great, the picture quality is terrible, it's clearly not fit for purpose, and I wonder how quickly Strata can to solve some of these issues. So if you could comment on those two issues, staffing and IT, what we're doing to try and remedy those, because it seems to me that's the low-hanging fruit here.
Yeah, sure, thank you. So on the IT aspect, I did share, well, I shared the survey results and I shared this report with Lawrence, the Chief Operating Officer for Strata. So he is aware of the issue. I think there's a need to drill down, if you like, because what I sense from talking to different staff is that the same problems aren't experienced by the same people all the time, and getting to the bottom of, almost a sort of a classic, well, is it your own personal internet, or is it actually design faults or issues or glitches or bugs in the system or the global desktop is something that we need to refine. But certainly, Strata have been very responsive in terms of addressing issues that have been raised, and I just think it's one of those things where persistence is going to address the thing. I don't sense from talking to Lawrence that it's a whole system change. I think it's the fact that we have 450 different devices at any one time, perhaps connecting into the global desktop, and that is the issue that Strata are addressing. But that's certainly work in hand, and they know about it, and they know that we want it sorted. The issue around recruitment is more problematic, I think. I mean, the actual recruitment process is a shared endeavour between the HR team and also the team that's looking to recruit. So a lot of the administrative processes are shared between those two teams to progress things. So there is an issue there about the way in which the two teams combine to sort of press ahead with things. Some of it is to do with the fact that there is a lot of recruitment going on, and then the issue of whether we can recruit appropriate staff, I'm afraid, then comes down to a range of factors. Some is the market in the terms of, are there enough, be it planners, be it environmental health officers, be it housing surveyors around to apply for and hopefully have the right skills that we're happy to appoint to. I mean, the approach that I've always tried to instill throughout the organisation is, if in doubt, don't appoint, because I think we know that making a bad appointment is worse than making no appointment at all. So, if in doubt, don't appoint. So we do want to make sure that when we appoint, ideally, we make the right appointment. I think some of it will be related to the pandemic and lockdown, because there are arguably at least two different employment markets that we want to tap into. One is the local employment market, and that'll be the market that will be very much sort of directed towards street scene people, for example, admin people, but certainly locally based people, if you like, who will look to sort of say, I might live in Exeter and I'm prepared to commute, 10 miles maybe to a job, no more than that, or I might live in Axminster or wherever. So there's always a local market for staff for some of the services that we look to recruit to. But then there's also probably a regional, if not a national market, certainly for the professional staff that we look to recruit to. And I would say that that has been problematic during lockdown, particularly because staff aren't able or willing to consider relocating. That being said, we have appointed some staff. I think one is still living in Edinburgh, but working for us in the planning team. And I know that there are other staff based quite far afield who haven't relocated but are working remotely and doing a good job for us. So some of it is then the availability of staff to relocate to the district, if you like, and then you bring into issues, the affordability of being able to relocate down here, and then the relative attractiveness or not, as the case may be, with the salaries that we're offering. And that was what John Golding was alluding to in his report that Cabinet considered at its previous meeting, which is that the sort of the rejig that we were able to do with regard to grades 1 to 5, or scales 1 to 5, grades 1 to 5, would help with the local market really. But we do need probably quite promptly or urgently to look at the grades 6 to 11 and further if need be, because there we're appealing to a more regional stroke a national market. And we're looking to entice people from potentially quite far afield to come and work for us. But there is also just the general problem of, a shortage of professionals wanting to work in local government, the public sector generally, I think. And that's just been a trend over a number of years in some of the established professions. So housing, we compete with housing associations, for example. And generally speaking, they've been able to offer better terms and conditions than we have, for example. So it's a complex picture, but we are aware of it, and we persevere.
Thank you. What Mark could have told you is we've now apparently recruited a new HR manager, so that might help us along those. To overcome some of those issues. I noticed, Jack, you had your hand up, but I'll come to Helen first as she's a member of the committee, then I'll come back to you. Okay? Over to you, Helen.
Thank you. And I want to go back to what we were talking about before. I'm very shocked, and I'm sure we all are, how many times in this suggested actions list it involves changes in members' behaviour, and more training is going to take a while. But there's this question of reinforcement of good member behaviours, and that involves code of conduct and standards board actions. And I'm really wondering whether there's anything more that can be done to reinforce this good behaviour, because clearly it's mentioned throughout in the columns of actions, and I'm just wondering whether staff actually do have faith in the standards board enforcing this, or if there's any way that Mark can suggest that it can be better enforced. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't think there's any denying that we have had I'm talking from a staff perspective now. We have had a difficult time for a variety of reasons since the last elections. Having said that, you have to be optimistic and hope that councillors want to do a good job. And it's understanding, I think, what doing a good job means in the context of the role of councillors within an organisation, particularly, a council of some size, which is a very complex organisation. We run a whole range of services which no normal business would do, if you like. There's a massive set of governance requirements, constitutional requirements, legal requirements, administrative requirements with regard to all that. And it does take some learning, I think. So my sense is that, and this is perhaps coming back to what Councillor Davey has mentioned already in this meeting, my sense is that the issues, the difficulties that have arisen are now acknowledged. I think it was arguable whether, in fact, they were acknowledged previously, but I think they are now acknowledged, and I take at face value, and the staff and the union have taken at face value the statement and the and all its contents that Councillor Loudon made. So the way I see it, and the way I conceptualise it, is that arguably we had 2 years of inappropriate behaviour in some respects, but we've now had 2 months of, broadly speaking, appropriate behaviour, and I want to focus on that, really, that there's a sense of it is understood how councillors can get the best out of the organisation, get the best out of the officers, and get the best delivery, if you like, for the district, really. Looking forward to May 2023, when the next elections are due, it would be nice to be able to say, well, we ended up with a score draw, 2-2 type thing, going into those next elections. So I think it's a learning thing. We have a new chair of council, as you know. I think he's at this meeting too, and he's now chair of the personnel committee. So there are undoubtedly issues with regard to the code of conduct and the standards regime, and this is where local government can be its own worst enemy at times, or its own best friend, depending on the council itself. So where you find councils that have gone adrift and awry, and there have been some in the press recently, Liverpool, for example, that's because the culture within those councils has been allowed to become dysfunctional for a variety of reasons, I think. I think what my view as the chief executive now is that we will not let that happen, and I think councillors acknowledge we can't let that happen. So going forward, as I say, I'd like to approach it on an optimistic basis of saying, we know what we need to do to try and address this issue of staff morale. We know that if we can address the issue of staff morale, it will actually help resolve some of the hygiene factors that are coming through, if you like, in this report, in terms of concerns about capacity, concerns about pay, concerns about equipment, and the like. So I think that's how I view it. Yeah, I don't know if that helps sufficiently.
Well, I hope what you're saying is that you do have faith in the standards board and the way that behaviour can be enforced, because that's what we all need to know, that there is a system that will do that.
Well, I wouldn't want to be misquoted. My advice is that members need to take responsibility collectively and individually for their own behaviour. I do think that if it gets to the stage of complaints, and tit for tat complaints and all that type of thing, then this is what Councillor Loudon was referring to in his statement. That of itself doesn't help the organisation act cohesively. So as much as there was the issue addressed in Councillor Loudon's statement around the relationship between members and staff, equally, there is a need, I think, collectively for members to work their way through, if you like, the scenario that we're in, of many groups on the council, many allegiances and alliances, if you like, amongst those groups on the council, and how that can be corralled, and if necessary, better working practices in terms of facilitating communication and dialogue between the groups themselves, the leaders of the groups, if there's like a shadow member of a group for a particular area, all those types of things. It's trying to get to a position whereby that level of interaction between the members themselves builds up mutual respect between the members, and that's where I think the thing can improve generally. I would say, and I say this with all due deference, but I have been a monitoring officer of 2 councils in the past. I think if you leave it, to the standards committee stroke, subcommittee hearings, then you've got a problem already, really. That should only be for the real exception, the real bad penny, if you like, not sort of as a normal recourse, really. That's my personal opinion.
Thank you, Mark. Jack, you've been very patient.
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate being given the opportunity to speak, especially as I'm not a member of the committee anyway, so thank you for that. It goes without saying that in any organisation, people are the most important asset, and having worked at senior management levels, both in primarily the private sector, but also in the public sector, I like to think that I know how to treat people and deal with them to get the best response out of people. And that's, speaking personally, that's certainly since becoming a finance portfolio holder, that's the routes that I've always tried to follow. And I've always gone out of my way to thank staff for the contribution that they've made, especially over this really difficult period that we've experienced. So I think it's important as well that each group, if they recognise inappropriate behaviour within their own group, do try to take action within their group to challenge that. And it's been alluded to when Councillor Davey mentioned before, there has been some soul searching within our own group, and I hope that's beginning to show the benefits. Speaking specifically about the suggested actions, there was a couple of questions I'd like to ask if I can. One is I'm particularly interested in carrying out the review of pay and benefits, because the recent report that John Golding gave about street scene really highlighted the issue that we're facing. And one of the things that stuck in my memory was the fact that at one point, for those pay scales we were looking at, that in the past we were very much in the median level, and we seem to have slipped to the lower level, which is why there was such urgency to take action about that. So I'm interested to see how it's going to pan out for a review of the other grades as well, to see if that same picture does emerge, to see that whether as a council we need to take action on that. Obviously from the finance portfolio point of view, I appreciate the potential impact that may have when we're talking about the medium-term financial plan. But as I said right at the very beginning, the people in this organisation are the most important asset we have. So it's important that we do make sure that how they reward.
Jack, I don't want to interrupt this. I did say this was for specific questions. Now you're making very broad statements, but I'd like to know exactly what question you're asking.
I was asking the question about the review of the pay scales and what have you. That was my specific question, which I thought I had mentioned.
Can you comment on that specifically, please, Mark?
Yeah, certainly. So thanks for that question. So the chair mentioned earlier that we do have a new corporate HR manager starting. So Jo Fellows starts on Monday next week, 2nd of August. I'm meeting with her on Monday, and we'll be discussing how best to proceed with that piece of work. And that will be something that I'll be looking to recommend at the meeting of the Personnel Committee in September. So it will require some assistance in all probability, because, you know, our policy is to be, you know, a median pay employer. Of course, that's never a fixed point. It's always a bit of a range. And of course, what you can find over time is that, you know, that you get towards the bottom end of median rather than the middle of median or the top end of median. So you know, that's a piece of work that we're going to assess how best to take forward, and if necessary, make recommendations to the Personnel Committee in September, Jack.
Mike, I noticed you got your hand up. Have you got you did have a go earlier. Have you got anything specific to ask?
Yes, I did actually, and thank you for giving me the opportunity, Chair. It's on page 14 of the report, and I welcome the idea of further training for members around who is responsible for what and who to contact with requests. I'm not sure if Mark can tell me if there have been any requests that he knows that have been blocked in the past, but I do stress the benefit of good relationships between members and officers for information purposes. I've always found that the vast majority of officers are very good at keeping you in the picture and telling you what's about to happen, certainly up until the end of 2019. The other thing is the recommendation about members should not micromanage projects and reporting. Do you know if any of the members actually write or edit the reports from officers? Thank you, Chair.
The process of preparing a report does go through a draft report process, and quite often that is shared or should be shared. And I think what that factor there is a reference to is that some officers particularly find a level of, dare I say, pedantic interference in their report writing to be particularly undermining and destructive towards their confidence and their morale, really. I think that's probably the best way I can explain it in general terms.
That definitely identifies a need for training. Right. I see no hands up. Oh, sorry, Alistair, have you got a question to ask? And then I'd like to throw it open then to debate by the panel. I think Mark has answered a lot of questions, which might actually make our debate more valuable and more reasoned. So I did see you've had your hand up for some time. Is it a specific question, please?
No, thank you, Chair. It's just a general observation, if I may. But if this is the appropriate time to do it, I can carry on. No,
I'd just like to thank Mark for answering those questions. I think he's covered a great many points, which certainly have added meat to the bone. The one thing I picked up on, and it's fairly common, is this business about training and, if you like, knowledge of members. I know when I was first a district councillor, sometimes being very frustrated that things were not happening as I thought they ought to us. But fortunately, because there weren't that many new members, there was help and support from older members to help us. And I think a lot of it is to do with training, that members need to be made aware of the issues. And I actually think, and perhaps I shouldn't be saying this until the end, I actually think the one thing that's missing that I would have put in here, the role of not just think tank, we used to have the think tanks and champions, but the role of portfolio holders. I know that when I was a portfolio holder and we rolled out the waste and recycling thing, that was a period of great deal of unrest, comment, criticism, for all reasons. We weren't picking up, some people didn't believe. Now, I encouraged any member who was getting strife, grief from their members, from their residents, to filter them through me. And because I was in a position, knowing the bigger picture, to explain what the difficulties were, not ignoring the difficulties, saying I would do what I could to get the difficulties fixed. And I think, I might be wrong, but I think portfolio holders perhaps should make themselves more open and perhaps be the first point of contact by members who feel they've got a grievance on behalf of residents, than perhaps jumping straight on some officer. Now, I might be totally off the wall saying that, but that's certainly how I took my responsibility as a portfolio holder. Now, if that's something which the rest of the committee can debate, so I would like now again to re-emphasise my thanks for Mark, move on to the open debate. But I did mention to members early on. Sorry, I'm noticing your hand, Vicky. That
it's all right.
I'm keen that we don't go too much digging into the past. Mark sounded a rather optimistic note, and I think goodwill, training, acknowledgement of past, if you like, errors and misguided behaviour, that we can move forward to improve the council for councillors, for our officers and for residents. So I will now throw the debate open to members.
Sorry, Chair, I did actually have a question for Mark.
Well, come on, if it's just a question then, Vicky, please come in with that and then we'll move on to the debate.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question was, as one of the newer councillors, and when I joined the council, I did attend all the training for East Devon, etc. And I found that the democratic service were absolutely fantastic, but there isn't a lot of signposting as to where you're supposed to go and who you're supposed to go to with questions. So sometimes it can possibly feel like, as a new councillor, you're bombarding people with questions, etc. My question for Mark is, I agree wholeheartedly with onward going training for all councillors, regardless of how long you've been in the council, because it changes year to year and possibly, as we've noticed very recently, month to month. Mark, could you answer the question, please, as to when do you think this training would be put in place for signposting councillors? Because obviously we have new councillors starting all the time and people moving off, new people coming, etc. Could you advise us to that, please? Thank you.
Yes, so again, this is something that falls within Henry's work plan. I think he's trying to establish whether I think it's called the Member Development Working Group. Apologies if I got that a bit wrong. Whether to take it through them in the sense of, members designing their own training, if you like, as opposed perhaps to officers saying, this is the training you're going to have type thing. But yes, we know it's required. We know it's needs doing, and Henry is aware of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll now move on to debate, and it's normal for committee.
Excuse me, Tom. Can I ask the question, please?
Yes, go on. Then that will be the last question.
Yeah. Can I ask Mark when he expects to have staff back in Blackdown House? Because there's very few people there at the moment.
I appreciate your question, Colin, but I don't think actually that's something we're discussing at the moment. We're discussing staff going forward.
Yeah.
I would like to see, you know, my views are I would like to see Blackdown House running normally for members and officers, but that is not what we're here for this tonight. But I'm certain we can get a question from that in due time as the COVID situation changes. John, you were very much part of the initial response to this, and it was within your portfolio. So I would like you to, and I thank you for your apology. I would like you to set forward the history and the reasons why we're looking now to get this personnel committee independently chaired, because I think that is going to be a substantial way forward. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Chair. I had indicated prior to the meeting, if you recall, that I had hoped to be able to make comment on Mark's report. I didn't wish, and I didn't think it was appropriate I should ask questions of it. But do I have the opportunity to comment in support of Mark's report or not? I'm very happy, as you know, I'm very happy to talk about the build up and the background to the creation of the personnel committee.
Well, I think that's what I'm getting at, because I think, you know, we've recognised the problem. One of the solutions has been put forward to set up a personnel committee, democratically balanced and independently chaired. So I think that is what's more important. But I'm certainly, Mark welcomes your views that you would wish to comment favourably on his report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Well, if I do appreciate your indulgence, as I indicated in my correspondence with you earlier on, if I may then in two parts address both Mark and the committee. So the first bit is in regard to the report that you have in front of you. And obviously, like everybody else, my genuine thanks go to Mark for not only his report, but also his candid comments, as always. I know I can rely upon him for those. The list of key issues and the proposed actions in the report, I think, demonstrate that the issues affecting staff morale are not binary, and they aren't necessarily the same in every department or team, nor are they the same in all grades. I think Mark said it was a complex picture, and I very much concur with his interpretation. And anyone who's has had experience of staff surveys knows whilst they're a snapshot of how staff feel at a particular point in time, they also provide the employer, us, with the opportunity to reflect, to learn, and to set out actions to address the concerns raised, and to do so against the wider backdrop of what staff have previously raised and the total working environment. So it's been a tough couple of years for staff. Many have had to adapt to working and managing staff from home against a COVID backdrop. And the immediate and medium-term finances have 1 minute been quite concerning and the next a little bit less so. And yes, that is the world of local government finance, but nonetheless, it makes often for unsettling and possibly uncertain lives for our staff. In the last 2 years or so, this council has gone from decades of one-party dominance up until the 2019 elections. From then, this council went into those elections and until now, it's had 3 different leaders and it's had 3 different administrations, all of different objectives and political colour. There's also been an influx of many new members, like myself.
Yes, John, can I just interrupt you? We all know that, but those circumstances you're describing are still no excuse for rudeness, bullying, and the types of behaviour that Mark has informed me about.
And I would concur, and and with greatest respect, Chair.
But all I was looking for, and I was quite specific in you telling me how you see this personnel committee coming about. So would you please keep to that? Thank you.
Okay, I apologies, I completely misunderstood what you had invited me to do a couple of minutes ago, so please accept my apologies. Regarding the Personnel Committee, then I would say this. My experience informs my opinion that a local authority ought to have a committee that specifically focuses on issues relating to their staff and matters associated with their employment. Until this year's annual council, we didn't have such a committee. Indeed, my observations since being elected were that staffing issues really weren't at the forefront of any committee's mind, and that members' oversight of such issues was haphazard. All of this reinforced my view that we needed to create a personnel committee with the objective of oversight of staffing matters, and that within it, we would integrate the 3 existing staffing panels, namely interviewing chief officers, investigating and disciplinary committee, and the employment appeals. In effect, we have now created a one-stop shop for all staffing related matters. Having discussed this with the monitoring officer and having had a look at how personnel committees and a number of other councils operated, the personnel committee's terms of reference were drafted, submitted to the most recent annual council, and then adopted. After the committee was created back in May, I discussed with the leader that I ought to stand down as its chair and that the chair of council ought to be invited to take over this role. Paul Arnott quickly agreed to do this, firstly, because staff should have confidence that the chair of council, who's responsible for the probity and reputation of this council, would chair the committee dealing with matters relating directly to their employment. Secondly, it demonstrates to all members this administration's desire to remove party politics from staffing matters by having someone from outside of its group or even the official opposition to chair the committee. So, Chair, I hope that's a helpful introductory background into why we wanted to create the Personnel Committee. And you now have a new, the first chair, Ian Thomas, as the chair of Personnel Committee. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, John. Right. I'm looking for hands. Right. Open to members of the, sorry, Alistair, I didn't know whether your hand was still up or you want to now say something, because now I'll now throw it open for discussion by the committee, but please bear in mind what we're trying to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think we all get the impression from Mark that he's keen to move on from this. And I would concur with that, not least because I'm not privy to whatever had gone on in the past. And on hearing what we've heard this evening, I think I would like to remain in ignorance of what happened in the past. I've got 2 observations, really. One, these are both from my previous time as a councillor back in East Kent. The first was that I found extraordinarily important to praise officers, not just to themselves, but also whenever the need arose within cabinet meetings or particularly full council meetings. And that, for me and my working relationship with officers, went a very long way in terms of creating a good working environment. The second thing that Mark alluded to was member champions. I don't know whether East Devon District Council has a heritage champion, but that was a role that I held for 4 years, specifically to do with listed buildings. And as the role required, it was an overarching brief, which meant that I could roam throughout the district, not just within my ward, and act as a liaise between the sitting district councillor and planning officers and conservation officers. And again, that formed a very strong relationship and a flow of information that was otherwise not there. So those are 2 observations that I would throw into the pot from my point of view. But you know, this situation at the moment, for instance, for me personally, I haven't yet been into the council building, so I'm I'm at the moment conducting all my conversations with officers through emails and occasionally through Zoom. It's not satisfactory because face-to-face is really the only way to get a working relationship established. And, you know, and I've only got 2 years before the next election, so I'd like to do a lot within that time to make sure that I can say that I've represented the people that I represent, which is at the moment particularly difficult. But anyway, I'll throw those 2 observations in for what they're worth. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So I can say we used to have a heritage and sort of champion, and I noticed Councillor Helen Parr is shaking a nod in her head because she was one such, I think, with Alan Dent. Paul, I ought now to be asking Democratic Services, have you been keeping a tag of who put their hand up when? Because I've got so many yellow hands on my screen now, I can't quite clear. Sarah or Wendy, can you help me with that? Or
yes, Chair. It's Councillor Miller, followed by Councillor De Sarum.
Thank you very much. Oh.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to dare to move some recommendations, which a lot of which are actually based on the conversations that have been had so far, but also conversations I've had with a couple of colleagues, not in my political group. And I've also sense checked the wording with the Chief Executive and the Monitoring Officer who reviewed it and also suggested some alterations as well. Firstly, obviously, we've been given a blank canvas here. As a committee, we've been asked to consider the proposed actions and as a blank canvas. Firstly, I feel that we need to, as a committee, note and endorse the actions, the proposed actions set out in the Chief Executive's report. This report is going to be presented to Cabinet and the Personnel Committee in due course anyway. I think it's important Scrutiny endorse these actions. It's taken a lot of work from the Chief Executive and the service leads and strategic leads to gather all this information together. Secondly, I think there are some immediate things that we can help with. First of all, one of the bullet points, proposed actions, is on the fact that members, that some staff feel that members' meetings are going on for too long without the appropriate breaks. So, which obviously can, you know, it's harms the well-being not just of staff but of members as well if we don't have regular breaks in long meetings, and it can cause stress.
I just interrupt there, Paul. I agree that meetings are sometimes too long, but I think when you get onto points like that, you're getting into too much detail for this committee. Those are some things which can be brought to the Personnel Committee when they decide how such things should be managed in the future. So what I'm looking to do, in fact, what I hope this committee is looking to do, is to come up with firm recommendations based on the contents of the Chief Executive's report, because the feeling I'm getting from members so far is there was strong agreement with the tone and content of the report.
Well, I've got two firm further recommendations which I'll read out from the Chair.
Any recommendation now has to be firm, because it's got to be clear and unequivocal, so that the officer who we are deputing to make that decision on behalf of the committee must clearly understood exactly what the decision is this committee wishes to have made. Thank you. So if you carry on, Paul, then I'll come to my deputy who...
With that in mind, I will just read the recommendations with no preamble. Sorry, Chair. The Scrutiny Committee recommends that the Cabinet, through the portfolio holders for democracy and transparency and strategic planning, assess whether member champion roles should be reintroduced, particularly in respect of the Councillor's local planning authority, and that the Cabinet considers asking the Member Development Working Group to meet as soon as possible to review and revise the member training programme with a view to providing training designed to mitigate concerns raised in the staff survey. I was advised, Chair, that the other two things that I was speaking about earlier shouldn't be formal recommendations, and Anita has wording to that. The Deputy Monitoring Officer has wording to that effect. So with your permission, Chair, you may wish to refer to her, but I did speak to her before the meeting. And that's with regard to endorsing the actions set out in the report, which I think is very important for us to do.
Well, those two those two recommendations you made, they are quite clear. Can I come to my deputy, Val, because I might be looking for some support and guidance here, Val?
Just really the point that I wanted to make, it's under recommendations. Obviously, I'm proposing that we accept the suggested actions in the report. Where I think we need clarity, Councillor Miller has just referred to going to Cabinet and to personnel. I think we need clarity. Who is going to oversee that these actions take place, and the sort of time frame that we're looking for, because there's no point having actions if we can't measure them and make sure that they're achieved. So part of the recommendation in accepting the suggested actions is that would we be saying that the actions should be referred to the personnel committee to oversee that those actions are carried out? Does that make sense, what I've just said?
It doesn't make sense. And at the end of the day, personnel committee will be holding committee meetings will be publishing minutes, and those minutes should be a record of what action they have or have not taken. And I am sure this committee, if they feel there have been failings in actions being taken or the wrong actions being taken, this committee can hold the personnel committee to account as we do other committees.
Yes,
I think this committee is a committee which, if you like, should be the conscience of the council.
Yes, Chair, I'd like to second Val Ranger's proposal.
Thank you. May I add, is this appropriate to add two possible suggestions also for the personnel committee to consider? One is that there should be an inbox specifically to receive emails that any officer feels are rude, bullying, inappropriate, that those can simply be forwarded, and that inbox would be monitored by the chair of the personnel committee. And my final point is that I know some organisations have introduced an anonymous whistleblowers hotline. So without wishing to be controversial, although sometimes in the survey it was explicit that officers felt bullied by members, and that is completely unacceptable and inappropriate, it wasn't always clear by all the responses if some of the bullying didn't come about as a result of team conflict, for example, or a clash of personalities or differing expectations. So I think that is the advantage of an anonymous, where staff feel safe to be able to report any concerns via a whistleblowers hotline, because we all know, even filling in staff surveys, in organisations, sometimes people don't fill it in because they think, well, it won't make any difference. Sometimes they don't fill it in because they think, despite people saying it's anonymous, I know they can tell it comes from my computer because that's what IT people can do. And sometimes you think, if I speak the truth, my job, for example, won't be looked on favourably if I'm in conflict with a team member or even a manager, for example. So my recommendations are, one, an inbox for officers to send any emails, just to forward them on and say, I'm just a bit concerned about this email. And secondly, possibly an anonymous whistleblowers hotline, so people can report concerns safely. Thank you.
I have difficulty with anything anonymous, because how can it be investigated if you don't know who's actually making the complaint? I remember once a very old detective friend of mine said he used to take some anonymous tips with a pinch of salt, but occasionally he was very disappointed when one that he was expecting didn't arrive in his postbox. But that's another story. So but that's something for the committee to decide.
Well, Chair, could I just comment on those, please?
Yes, certainly.
So we already have a process in place now, and that's on the back of Councillor Loudon, well, the report that I took to Cabinet on the back of Councillor Loudon's statement around referral of all matters to me where a member of staff has a concern. And I would say that one of the reasons that the survey response was so powerful is that we had a 67% response rate. So I'm happy that staff trusted me to do right by them in terms of bringing this report or the previous report and this report to you. I genuinely do not believe it is appropriate to engage the chair of the Personnel Committee in this because it cuts across my role as head of paid service.
Yeah, I can. That's something for the committee to consider. Bruce, you've been waiting some time.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Chair. I'm sorry if I've come in a bit later. I wanted to firstly say, Mark, you've made a very superb and very fluent report. And looking at the report, I was wanting to ask about have a realistic and clear council plan that staff can work towards. I wondered whether this committee might like to give clear guidance to members because it goes on to say to help prioritise what they should and shouldn't be spending time on and what staff can say no to. So I'm wondering, to avoid conflicts, when we get the council plan, if we can actually have some form of guidelines as to what areas would be able to explore and what areas we can't explore, because it's all about managing members' expectations, because I believe the council plan is like a big wish list, and clearly members will get very frustrated if they can't have everything in their wish list. But if the committee could recommend that guidance will be given so that members can see where they could go to and what avenues they could take, like last night, for example, where the motion was put forward on trees and it's brought to overview. So I think there are various mechanisms that I'd ask this committee to look at as to how to channel members' frustrations into other areas which are very positive. So thank you very much indeed, Chair.
I think I can come in there, Bruce, and I don't know whether I'm sort of coming in too often. Once a council plan has been agreed, service leads then have to draw up their service plans to meet the aims of the council needs. And I noticed a smile from our chief executive then. And it is through this committee mainly, and I nearly said victim, but I was a subject at one of two occasions when the portfolio holder was held to account because the areas of response, the areas that he had some responsibility for, were not actually following through with their service plans, which need to be all the things we go to lingo, achievable, manageable, costed, measurable, all those things. So I think when we get a proper council plan, it is then up for service leads to produce their service plans, which are the plans or performance plans by which we as the scrutiny committee and thereby the council can actually hold the service leads and the, if you like, the high senior officers to account for what we perceive to be their promises. Am I roughly right there?
And just to help further, hopefully, Chair, Councillor Loudon and the leader do have now a draft of the proposed council plan with a view to it going to overview and scrutiny in September and October. I think, I can't remember, definitely September, maybe runs into October. I can't remember off the top of my head. So we are now getting close to the position where there will be a plan for this committee to consider as part of the process for adoption.
Thank you. Bearing in mind what Councillor Miller mentioned about long meetings and breaks, I will take Ollie, who I know his hand's been up for some time, but otherwise I think, and again, if we're in a room, I could see everybody. I think this committee is largely in very much agreement and support with the Chief Executive's plan. So, Ollie, then we have one recommendation. The full recommendation has not yet been seconded. So, Ollie, what have you got to say?
Chair, point of order, Chair. Val Ranger did put a proposal of accepting the Chief Executive's report, and I seconded it. And so we do need to have that clarified and voted on.
But the only trouble with that, Mike, is I agree with everything Val has said, but that is not a recommendation on which we're asking any officer to make a decision. We can make a decision to say we could recommend that we charge the officer to immediately implement all the actions carried out mentioned in the report. But I think that's too wide-ranging. I think if we are saying that lack of knowledge, lack of training has been a significant factor in perhaps members not acting as they should, the appointment of champion members, and I think to immediately review the training programme for councillors is a recommendation that officers can approve. But just saying we note and agree with the contents of the report does not actually make a decision.
Chair, with respect, if Val Ranger could repeat the recommendation, if you don't like it, we can always amend it. But there has been formally a proposal and a seconding of a proposal done, and that's the constitutional position.
Chair, shall I comment
Yes,
a moment?
yes, thank you, Anita.
It is entirely up to you whether you think it's appropriate to go to a vote at the moment. You don't have to. I would suggest, given that there were other recommendations floating around and you have other speakers waiting to speak, you may be better just to press on for a moment and see if you can come to some consensus, as is often the way with scrutiny, rather than bouncing to a recommendation at this point in time. It is your call as chair whether you believe it's time to take the vote or not.
I am anxious that we actually formulate a recommendation that we all agree with, but a recommendation that is realistic, that it actually recommends that some action is and can be taken. So I will now I'll come back to Ollie Davey, and thank you for your comments, Mike. Ollie?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, well, I'm happy to second the recommendations that Councillor Miller made, actually, which, if I've written them down correctly, were about member champions and about training for councillors. And it was just to say, I would welcome some training on how to target queries that we have, because members of the public do come to us. They ask us something, and my usual response is not to them, but my brain says I have no idea who to ask about this. And I then end up going through the council website, and I had one the other day about council tax, and I found the relevant pages. I actually found a frequently asked questions page, which actually helped me with some of the issues this particular person had. So I think knowing a little bit more about the different areas of the council would be quite helpful. But I've got to say, the portfolio holders, and I'm grateful to some of my colleagues actually who said, just ask the portfolio holder, particularly Jeff Young, who I've been in touch with recently about a street scene issue, which actually came out of a town council meeting. And I've got to say, I got a reply almost instantly from Jeff, sort of explaining the background to the particular situation that I was querying. So I think, the portfolio holders are not unaware of their role as an area for queries. But I certainly would welcome more training on that. I just want to say a word about praise, because I think it's very easy, and I think you'll find staff will very quickly become inured if we all preface every speech we make with, I just want to say how wonderful our staff are. As an ex-teacher, one of the things I learned about praise was that children will cease to take any notice of it unless you make it specific. And I think it's much better if praise is specific and praises certain behaviours rather than simply, oh, you're wonderful. So I think we should take the opportunity to praise staff, but if we can find a way of making that specific and saying, I just want to thank the member of staff who responded so quickly to my query the other day about such and such, then I think that is actually worth an awful lot more than just saying, and I just want to pay tribute to our wonderful staff all the time. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Ollie. At the moment, coming back to what Anita said, we have one proposition which was moved by Val Ranger and seconded by Mike Allen. And that was before Paul's recommendation was seconded. Now, on a matter of procedure, and I will come to you, Helen, on a matter of procedure, does the fact that one motion was seconded before the other make that motion the motion that should be looked at first?
Yes, Chair, I would suggest, I think we're slightly more complicated as well, because I think you've got two recommendations from Councillor Ranger, her points 1 and 2, that weren't seconded. Councillor Allen seconded Councillor Ranger's more general statement about the Personnel Committee being tasked to oversee. But I think we've got points 1 and 2, the inbox and the helpline, that weren't seconded as yet. But yes, I think we would be taking Councillor Ranger's first proposal, which we'll just need to firm the wording up on, seconded by Councillor Allen. And then if that fails, Councillor Miller's, or you may choose to take Councillor Miller's as well, because they are set, they're not opposing. So you could take those as well. As you say, I think it makes sense that the committee comes to an outcome that everybody is supportive of.
Thank you.
You've got two more speakers by the looks of things.
Helen, you've been up there.
Thank you. And I can't support the recommendations as they are, because I think any suggestion that we just note these actions would be completely wrong. We have got to say that we accept the recommendations of the Chief Executive in the suggested actions here, and we ask him to ensure that they are carried out by whoever should be carrying them out, obviously. So I really think we should say that we ask the Chief Executive to ensure that all these suggested actions are done, are carried out, please. I think that's vital that we recommend that.
Can I just also say, Chair, if it helps, I've deliberately mentioned both Cabinet and Personnel Committee, because under our Constitution, indeed the legal framework, some matters will fall to go to Cabinet and some matters will fall to go to the Personnel Committee. But I would also then say that, Councillor Barr is understanding of the position as I see it, in terms of these items form part of my work plan. I see myself as charged with taking these forward through the most appropriate vehicle, some of which will be the Personnel Committee, some of which will be Cabinet, and some of which will just be getting on with the day job of running the organisation, managing the staff.
That is exactly what I meant, Councillor Wright, that in the end, I think as councillors, we have to be absolutely clear that the person in charge of managing the staff is the Chief Executive, and we as councillors should be very careful about interfering in matters of personnel. It is down to the Chief Executive, who is, as he says, I can't remember the word he used just now, but he is the person who manages the staff, who is the head of paid service. And we should be, as I say, we should not be involved in a great many things to do with the staff.
Yeah, Chair, would you just like to see if there's if that's a proposal, whether we've got a seconder for that, and I'll add it to the list.
Point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mike.
I can understand that Helen is proposing an amendment to the substantive motion that Val Ranger put forward. In other words, to change the word note to accept. Now, if that is an amendment, it's no good shaking your head, Val. If it's an amendment, it's an amendment.
Excuse me, I never use the word note. Councillor Roger Giles.
We never use note.
Never use note. What a pointless statement that is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it might help greatly if chair, we could understand that what we're trying to achieve, which I think Val Ranger and I have been trying to achieve, is that we do accept the proposals that the chief executive has put forward. The only question is who then sorts it out, which is your point, Tom. And so if I could just clarify that by saying the chief executive should take it forward to discuss which route, whether it's cabinet or personnel committee, should put the things into action. Would that be acceptable, Val? Sorry, you're mute.
Yes, sorry. Yes, because now I'm getting a little bit confused about if I'm happy for the chief executive to show us the roadmap, as it were, because we have head of paid service, then we have head of HR, and then we have a personnel committee. And so who's responsible for what, where do they overlap? So that was why my wording was, I propose that we accept the suggested actions in the report, and that this should be referred. I said to the personnel committee, I take on board your points that perhaps different bits need to go to different people, but in order to measure it, then I think at some point, and it might not be right at this minute, we need to know this bit's going there, this bit's going there, this bit's going there, and then at the end it will all join up. So that would be helpful, I think. Otherwise, it's just a mishmash of somebody somewhere is doing it, but we're not sure who. So how can we measure it? Thank you.
So could I just conclude this, Chair?
Well, I think carrying on from what Val is saying, and what again, the tenor of this meeting, we all totally accept the contents and the suggested actions in this report. So I totally agree with Val on that this committee thanks and totally accepts the the suggested actions.
Could we vote on that point, Chair?
Yeah, but I'm just wondering, as an amendment to that, whether we could highlight those things which we think could have the swiftest and best outcome, and actually put a time constraint on those. Otherwise, parts of this are going to take a long time. Parts might be able to be implemented more rapidly. And so I totally accept Val's recommendation that we accept the report in its entirety. But I would like to actually, in order to put some pressure, like this committee, to come up with 2 or 3 actions. For example, Paul came up with champions the roles again, review the training program. Those are things which I can see having a fairly good impact in a reasonably short space of time. And also, and I'm certain Jack will appreciate this, they are things which are not going to have significant financial implications, because a lot of what the chief executive here is suggesting would actually have to go through cabinet and budget to agree the budget to implement them. Now,
would it help, Chair, if I hesitate to say this because I do want to take some leave in August, but I will prepare if you like, a project plan to guide, members generally, so that they understand, how each aspect is going to be attacked, if you like, with the caveat that some of the timetabling will be broad, because it will need to tie in, for example, with the adoption of the council plan. It will need to tie in with consideration of the draft budget. It will need to tie in with a range of other things. But broadly speaking, you know, you all accept the objective of which is to restore staff morale. The issue is how we get there. There are a number of actions which, you know, the committee accepts need to be undertaken to get there. What I need to do, if you like, perhaps having heard the sort of the sense of the committee, which is that, yeah, carry on almost, isn't it? Carry on, get on with it. Then I can prepare a project plan which can be circulated sometime later next month.
Chair,
Yes.
could I suggest some wording that I think Henry put forward earlier that picked up some of the suggestions that were circulating during the day? Obviously not as another proposal, but perhaps as a maybe a way through this. Would that be acceptable, Chair?
I think so. But I'm anxious that, as well as just accepting the recommendation, as we all want to have some constraint. And I think Mark's just come up with he's put himself on off. He's put himself on off to some extent.
I think this may help, Chair. Yeah. Henry's suggestion, and some of this is about wording that picks up the new ways of working with the delegated authorities as well, and it just deals with that. So the suggestion was, having received the report and noted the comments, members were accepting of endorsing the proposed actions set out in the Chief Executive's report, and that reports addressing the proposed actions will be presented to Cabinet and the Personnel Committee in due course. You may want to put a timeline on that. In due course, members also felt that the Chief Exec and or the Strategic Lead, Governance and Licensing, which is Henry, should liaise with all committee chairs and vice chairs to encourage managing their meetings so as to allow appropriate breaks from screens and for general comfort for the benefit of both staff and members. And then going on to say, the Scrutiny Committee recommends, and then the wording that Councillor Miller used earlier, that the Cabinet, through the portfolio holders for democracy and transparency and strategic planning, assess whether member champion roles should be reintroduced, particularly in respect of the Councillor's local planning authority, and that Cabinet considers asking the Member Development Working Group to meet as soon as possible to review and revise the member training programme with a view to providing training designed to mitigate concerns raised in the staff survey. And you could, if you want some timeline, I take Councillor Ranger's point, if you wanted some timelines in there, you could put some timelines in there to tie in with the Chief Exec's offer of a roadmap.
As soon as possible is something I don't like to see anywhere. We do need a time frame, because if that time frame proves impossible, it can then be adjusted with reasons. Val, how do you feel about that?
Yes, thank you. Yes, maybe if the Chief Exec is able to produce that that report about, you know, what will go where within the next month. I know it's holiday time as well, but I was just looking at my notice board about when is the date of the next scrutiny meeting? Is that too tight a time frame to have the outline of what will go where? Would that give us a time frame?
To know when the next scrutiny meeting is.
I'll check when it is.
I don't think we normally meet in August, do we? From memory. We're like the French, nothing happens in August.
I've got it, excuse me, sorry to interrupt. I've got it down as the 9th of September on that list that was sent out. Yeah. I don't know if that's too soon. And then after that, it's the 7th of October.
Well, can I aim for the 7th of October, Chair? Because certainly before then, in any event, there will have been a report to the Personnel Committee on at least one of the aspects contained in this report.
I think we've had a very good discussion. The one thing that's come out is that the unity we all have in getting something done to improve staff morale, and I think that actually is sincere. So I suppose I could propose from the chair Henry's wording together with Val's requirement that there is a time frame for the chief executive to report to the scrutiny committee a more detailed plan to achieve the aims set out in the document. Can you make some sensible grammatical English of that, Anita, please?
Happy to second that.
Okay, and that probably answers the question. We just need the previous proposers just to withdraw. So Councillor Miller, Councillor Ranger, seconded by Councillor Davey and Councillor Allen. If everybody's happy to withdraw the previous iterations, then that leaves us with this.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Then can we now put that to the vote then? I've moved it, so it doesn't need seconding.
No. Okay, all in favour, if you use your green ticks, please, to vote yes, red crosses for no, and electronic hands to abstain.
Can we just have a rereading of the proposal we're voting on, please?
Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly. Let me just move it to a different screen. So the wording, the original wording is, having received the report and noted the comments, members were accepting of endorsing the proposed actions set out in the Chief Executive's report, and that reports addressing the proposed actions will be presented to Cabinet and the Personnel Committee in due course. Members also felt that the Chief Exec and/or the Strategic Lead Governance and Licensing should liaise with all committee chairs and vice chairs to encourage managing their meetings so as to allow appropriate breaks from screens and for general comfort for the benefit of both staff and members. And then it goes on to say the Scrutiny Committee recommends that the Cabinet, through the portfolio holders for democracy and transparency and strategic planning, assess whether member champion roles should be reintroduced, particularly in respect of the Councillor's local planning authority, and that Cabinet considers asking the Member Development Working Group to meet, this wording is, I'll come back to this, to meet as soon as possible to review and revise the member training programme with a view to providing training designed to mitigate concerns raised in the staff survey. So we need to put, I think we probably just add to that recommendation that, Mark, are you saying you'll bring your report back to scrutiny on what we think is the 7th of October? That you'll bring a road.
I'll bring a report back on the 7th of October, giving the Scrutiny Committee hopeful reassurance on when and how I will be addressing the actions in this report.
Okay, so adding that to that wording to the bottom of as an additional recommendation. So we'll come back to you for the 7th. Is that everybody okay?
Thank
so
you.
If we just,
I'm very happy with that. Yeah.
Okay, so if we just confirm, I don't think we got as far as numbers. If we could just confirm the vote, green, whatever they're called, green ticks, red crosses, electronic hands. That is 10 green crosses. 9 green ticks. Sorry, it's too complicated, isn't it? So that's carried. Thank you, Chair.
It was 10 green ticks.
Yes.
Any against?
There were none. There were just 10 green ticks.
Just for clarification for the record.
Okay, 10 green ticks, none against, no abstentions.
Thank you. And now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the paper to do with the enforcement effort within East Devon District Council's planning. I must say that when I read the report, I was absolutely amazed that there was no legal requirement for local authorities to actually carry out any enforcement action at all. We've all read the report. I think we have all, as councillors, been affected by complaints about lack of planning enforcement. What I'm anxious to do is not actually bring this down to people discussing little problems they've had individually on their patches, that we look at the report and try and come up with a recommendation which deals with the general problem, not with specific instances. So, Val, I see you're first in.
Yeah, thank you. So it seems to read, it seems to boil down to, if we want further enforcement than we've already got, and you can correct me if I'm not getting this right.
We've got to pay for it.
We have to employ a qualified surveyor. So for me, some of this discussion, I think, needs to be, do we want to do that? What I didn't get the sense of from the report, and I guess that's a difficult one, is whether officers felt. I mean, that's what's important to me. Do officers feel that they are well resourced enough? That was kind of what I was getting at. I think when I raised this, do they feel under pressure, under conflict? Do they need more support? Yes, so for me, I think that is, for me, that's part of tonight's debate is, are we happy with the status quo? If we want more, we're going to have to pay for it. And obviously, and I know that can't be a decision made here, it has to go forward for budgeting and all sorts of purposes. But yeah, I don't know if, who have I just seen here who could speak on this for officer? Ed, I see Ed is here. I don't know if Ed has a sense of whether officers feel under pressure. Perhaps he could answer that one.
Yes, through you, Chair. I think the situation fluctuates fundamentally. There are obviously times where officers feel more under pressure than at other times. I think generally when all three planning enforcement officers are in the office and working, then there is adequate capacity. But obviously there are times when one or more of them is on leave or sick leave. We had a situation last year when one of them needed an operation and was out of action for a couple of months actually, which did put a lot of pressure on the other two. So I would say that there's no slack in the system, but when all three officers are in post, there is adequate capacity. I don't think we have the luxury, I suspect, of being resourced to have more than is necessary. So it's just a fact of prioritising when those situations arise where we don't have all three in post and operating at the same time, which has served us well up till now. And I think I think once say that I think overall there is sufficient capacity given the scope of the work that we're doing. But as the report says, if members want us to take a more proactive approach and actively monitor developments that are taking place, then that would require additional resource and in some respects different skills and expertise than we currently have. Thank you.
I'll bring the committee's attention again just to the recommendation to consider the planning enforcement process and the resourcing of this area. Make recommendations for changes in the planning enforcement process, or make any recommendations for changing to the resourcing of the planning enforcement service. Now, from what Ed's just said, he feels that generally they are coping. But I know at the last planning meeting I attended, we had a number of cases that came to before us that were largely due to the fact that we were having to make legal circumstances that had been pertaining in various properties because no one had been checking up on whether or not planning conditions had been adhered to. Now that is the thing that I felt frustrated me, and not just the minor things where somebody might have built an extension a bit too big, but actually that there does not seem to be any protocol system for ensuring that conditions, when they are imposed, are actually adhered to. It seems to be if people don't complain within the allotted time, we've just lost it. And that's where my concerns are. And some of them were people living in a house for several years, completely out of keeping with the condition of a tied tenancy to do with agriculture. And our hands are tied. We just had to grant permission because no one had ever in the intervening years taken any action to see if the conditions were being complied with. That's my take on it, rather than just somebody complaining that somebody's used the wrong coloured brick or has got slightly different windows. But anyway, I'll throw it up. Can someone help me? Who is next? Who? Sarah?
Yes, Councillor Allen, Chair, followed by Councillor Bailey.
Right you are then, Mike.
Yes, I think this is a regular recurrent problem that people buck the system, and it's frustrating because what is the point of having planning conditions if we can't enforce them? So the key for me is that we don't have the resources to carry out routine monitoring of construction sites. And if we tried to put that resource in place, it would require a quite large number of inspectors to go out and check. So I think that one alternative is that when planning permission is given to small developments, that the neighbours are told that they have the right within 2 years to alert us to any variations of the planning permission. In other words, we mobilise the community. And when it comes to issues of large-scale developers, I think that we have 3 people who are expert in checking those particular developments, and we should enforce the proper dimensions, because we have examples in Axminster and in Cranbrook where one particular developer completely abused the planning dimensions given. And this comes back to something we were discussing at the Strategic Planning Committee about minimum building regulations, sizes for rooms and so on. It's no point putting these things into practice unless we can reinforce. So I would suggest that we put it back to the SMT level to decide whether or not a resource is needed for large-scale developments. But I do recommend that there is a slight change in how we communicate planning conditions, and that we do so to the neighbours of the people who are around the planned development for small developments. Thank you, Chair.
And then it was Jess. Jess.
Hi, thank you very much. So I agree with Councillor Allen that things are a bit different with the really big developers. And I think one of the things that we really need to think about is at the early stages of a development, the way in which items are conditioned, because I have one particular example, and I know we don't want to get into kind of teeny tiny examples, but one example of when basically the developers still haven't fully delivered a play park for, and they're a really big developer, they're Bovis, and they haven't delivered it, but their condition has been signed off because of the way that it was drafted. So I think that actually that could have been drafted in a different way so that it wasn't signed off until the point at which it was actually delivered. It was basically the condition related to being required to submit plans and a timescale. So they submitted the plans and the timescale, but never actually built it. So
you know, that's a kind of example of how if at the start we get the conditions right, then actually we can control the development. And I don't know whether that's something that happens has happened on other sites. So I'd be interested to know what Ed has to say. Thank you.
Ed can certainly answer that, but I think the issue is, I think I've heard from many councillors throughout the district that they're dissatisfied with the way enforcement is carried out. Now, if we as a committee would want to recommend that we don't think our enforcement effort is sufficient, and I know it comes down to resources, and we can't put strain on an under-resourced service to carry out that work. But if we were to actually come to the conclusion, we could recommend that that council consider, or cabinet considers, the question of enforcement, because they are the only people who could actually allocate resources. We can't allocate resources. We could recommend that money should be spent, and this might be something we want to do here so that the enforcement effort is seen to be more comprehensive and more effective. Now, is that a fair interpretation of how we've, certainly councillors I spoke to and on the planning committee regularly offer, as Helen will bear me out, regularly offer the same comment and feeling. Who's next?
Councillor Parr, then Councillor Ryland, Chair.
Right, Helen.
Yes, well, I can respond to you because obviously that is what councillors say. But I want to look at the chart that is contained in this report. And I do think that, and having been chair of planning, I know we had a lot of enforcement cases that would come to chairman, and we had to understand why certain action was taken or why action wasn't being taken, and the enforcement officers would regularly explain what was happening in cases. But if we look at that chart, we can see that a large chunk of cases were either, after checking the development was in accordance with permission, or permission wasn't required, or activity had ceased. Then a number where permission was granted, obviously they were required to put in a planning application, and then it was decided that what they'd done was acceptable. Then there was insufficient evidence. And actually, I think very few of these cases where action could be taken, or where there was actually technically a breach. I mean, it's minute. And although everyone gets absolutely furious because it's so antisocial when people don't abide by the planning system, and they do just go off and develop things without permission or deliberately not according to permission, and everybody gets extremely angry about that. I do think we have to understand what powers the authority has, and I think it would be really helpful if this report was sent to all councillors so that all councillors could be aware of how the enforcement system works. And also, I think if possible, councillors liaise with the enforcement officers, who I've found are absolutely excellent, and just when there is a problem, find out you know, what can be done, because we have to work, or the officers have to work according to the powers they're given. I think that's really important that all councillors find out what the powers are, how the system works, and don't have too high expectations. Thank you.
The common theme again coming back to disseminating knowledge and how the systems work. That seems to be a common feature. It was Eleanor next, I think, didn't you say?
It's Councillor Rylant, then followed by Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. Ed, I don't know whether this is the case, but I feel like everybody sat through lockdown drawing up plans to put in planning applications, and I just feel like, I note what you said about feeling adequately resourced, but I just wonder whether planning applications have been noticeably up this year. In terms of enforcement, do you keep a log of the kind of things that occupy the team's time the most? I mean, is it possible to draw any kind of generalities about the type of case that would occupy the most time and be the most recurrent, I guess? In terms of growth points, my understanding was that we weren't allowed to inspect buildings in growth points. Is that still the case? Because I thought that they employed their own inspection teams. And if there are planning application breaches, how do we discover them, I guess? Is it by chance? Is it by people reporting them? And lastly, but not least, it's about permitted development rights and specifically PDQs. Do you feel like we have enough clarity on what PDQs are permissible, so to speak, and what aren't? Because farm buildings, I mean, a Victorian milking parlour is probably not going to be very useful as any kind of farm building by modern standards. But something like a modular Dutch barn, it's a bit more moot, really, whether or not it's redundant in 2021 and whether it could not just be dismantled and removed if it is really genuinely redundant. And I know that, particularly out in the countryside, that is the kind of case that really gets people exercised, whether or not a PDQ is permissible or not, or should be permissible, or whether whether people, because for clarity, a PDQ, people tend to be able to get planning permission a fair bit easier. And I know that those are the kind of things that exercise people, especially in the countryside. So sorry, that's a lot of questions in one go, but and I can repeat them if you didn't get them all. Thank you.
Sorry, Eleanor, you're making very valid points, but were they to do with actually enforcement or just to do with people seeking planning permission and being granted when some people thought they shouldn't get it? Because that was a completely, we all have those cases.
I mean, I have cases in my ward where people will just go ahead and build something in open countryside and wait to be found. That happens fairly routinely in a couple of particular sites. And I just wonder, how do we feel like we're adequately resourced as a local authority against this kind of action? And what remedial action are we actually realistically able to take in that situation? I mean, do we feel as though we are in a battling dragons, really, that we can't really vanquish here? Because that's do we have the right sort of powers to fight, to be able to enforce certain types of things? Because I feel like there's some types of case are taking up a lot of time, and actually in the end they're not really resolvable because we don't really have the right teeth or the right number of teeth. I mean, that's the impression that I get, really, when I see some of the cases that come forward and maybe get permission later.
I think the report sets out that we have no teeth. We can't tell them to bulldoze it down. At the end of the day, we can take action, which then goes to the inspector and the courts. I mean,
I have been successful with some things in my ward where, arguably, and I think the inspector agreed with me, really they shouldn't have been built in the first place. But I just wonder, once we get to that stage, what's our ability to enforce, say, removal of the footings? Because
Ed can answer the technical legal problems, but I know the courts, the inspector, they can then resort to civil action and through the courts require action is taken.
But I guess what I'm asking is that purely at our instigation, or is that a process that can be undertaken independently of us, or does it require more resources from us in order to be able to take these cases forwards? more resources that we may not have.
Ed, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I think as the report highlights, there are some fundamental issues in terms of what teeth we actually have to take action under the legislation. I think that is a frustration that I hear regularly from members, and we as officers share in that, you know, the rules of natural justice don't really apply, in the sense that if you do something without planning permission, you can apply retrospectively, and if it's acceptable in planning terms, it'll be granted, and there's no penalty for having gone ahead without permission and applying retrospectively. Equally, if someone goes ahead and does something without planning permission and we conclude that it's actually acceptable in planning terms and they don't make an application, we can't force them to make an application, and we just have to write it off because we can't take action against something that's acceptable in planning terms. In fact, I think we have commented on some government consultations on reforms to the planning system, saying that there should be an opportunity to impose sort of spot fines on things that are carried out without permission, and you know, changing the planning enforcement legislation to enable fines to be imposed more readily, which could then finance more resources to then be more proactive. And I think that's ideally what I would like to see happen as a professional planner, but that does involve changes to the legislation. That's not about what we're doing and not something that we have any control over. So I think that's what a lot of these issues boil down to. In terms of some of Councillor Rylance's other points, I mean, one of the things that occupies the team's time the most is explaining all of this to people, because there is a natural frustration that we can't take action against certain matters, and it's very hard to make people understand that. And so we do spend a lot of time as officers explaining the system to people. Particularly things like the new permitted development rights, which are mind-bogglingly complicated for anyone to try and understand, not least our own officers, and then to explain that to members of the public who are rightfully struggling with that. The irony of which is the government brought in those changes to try and reduce red tape, but I don't think it has really. So there are lots of issues there. Certainly workloads have increased. Application numbers are up 26% so far this year. So that has an impact, but the enforcement officers don't deal with applications. They are separate from that, and I think there has been an increase in their workload, but not of that magnitude. We can inspect buildings on growth points. I think there's a misunderstanding there in terms of building regulations, where much of the major house builders use approved inspectors for building regulations, other than at Cranbrook, where Persimmon do use ourselves at the moment. But from a planning perspective, we can inspect anything we want. From a planning perspective, we have one of the good things we have in the legislation is rights of access to go onto land to inspect works, which are excellent. In fact, in some cases, they're better than the police's right of access to land. So that's one area where the legislation is helpful to us. Yes, so ultimately, a lot of time is taken up explaining the legislation to people and dealing with people's frustrations with the planning enforcement legislation, and the fact we haven't got more teeth. But I don't think there's a way around that. We've tried to put things down in paper. There's the local planning enforcement plan that's referred to in the report, which is on our website, and hopefully provides a plain English guide to the system. Again, unfortunately, in explaining it, it's 38 pages long, but hopefully it is a useful document for those that take the time to read it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ed. Maddie, I think you've been very patient, and I haven't heard from you all evening.
Oh, that's all right. I'll wind up now. This is for Ed and John Goulding. I need to understand this a bit more. Ed will probably realise what I'm on about when I say Plum Park. Now, when a developer of a large development comes forward to the planning department, their contractors are given a route, as far as I am aware, for deliveries with times, and how the development should be run, i.e. if it's hot, and dusty. It needs to be hosed down. How much enforcement can you put on developers? Because I am aware that when Plum Park started, the environmental health team were virtually up there every single day, which must have driven John Golding absolutely mad, because the lorries were coming out of the development full of rubble. They weren't covered over. They were going down Douglas Avenue. They were going down Cranford Avenue. They were going down roads that they weren't supposed to, dropping mud and everything. And the neighborhood went absolutely mad. How much enforcement can we put in? Is there anything else we can do as a council to make the developers be responsible for their contractors that they obviously asked to bring stuff in and out of the site? Thereby, if we've got an enforcement officer there, we won't have the environmental team up and down there every day. And sometimes, we had 2 environmental health officers on the site for about 3 weeks. I mean, it was awful. Can you give me some clarity on this, Ed? And maybe John can tell me about the environmental health team and their problems as well on this. Thank you, Chair.
Well, Ed, that's a specific one, but I think the broad question is, when we have construction plans as part of and route plans as part of the planning application, which is not at all uncommon, do we actually go out and monitor that those plans are being adhered to?
They aren't.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, construction environmental management plans we've increasingly used on the large scale developments to control how construction takes place and its impacts. Again, as was sets out in the report, it's very much a reactive approach when we receive complaints. We don't have the resources to proactively go out. In order to do that, as Councillor Chapman has alluded to, you'd almost have to have an officer stationed at the entrance of the site all day, every day while the work's taking place, and that's just not practical or realistic. But obviously we can rely on residents where things are harming their amenity to highlight those to us, and we've taken action when that is the case, as was done in Plum Park. I think there were some issues when they first started, because they started in the summer when it was very dry, and they had lots of issues with dust, and as a result carrying material onto the road, and it did take a few weeks of intensive work between the planning enforcement officers and the environmental health officers to get things under control, as it were, and get them to put measures in place that were required under the construction environmental management plan, and get things on an even keel. And I think once that was done, things were much better. I know there were some issues with the routing of vehicles last summer, I think, which we took some action about. In actual fact, I think, if memory serves, they were largely complying with the routing plan. It was just that was causing some problems in the summer season, and we had to get them to deviate from that plan to accommodate local circumstances, I think, along the seafront and other works that were happening in Douglas Avenue at the same time, which was a bit of unfortunate timing. So yes, those issues can be resource intensive. Again, if we had more resources, we could obviously be more proactive in that approach. It comes down to what the priorities are. But I would say, as I said in the report, what we generally find is where things are causing harm to people's amenity, they are very quick to alert us to those issues, and I'd like to think we are quick to respond and address their concerns. So it's very difficult to quantify how many cases we are not aware of where harm is arising and we would want to take action. It can't, it's trying to quantify the unknown. So it's difficult to know in terms of that, but the reactive approach does certainly highlight things where there is an obvious impact and people are affected by that. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, can I come back?
Is it general or just specific on Plum Park?
Yeah. No, I just wanted to know if the developers have ever been fined for not enforcing what the planning regulation was. And if they were fined, of course, then you'd have the resources to employ another enforcement officer, I would have thought.
Well, I think the question with that, Maddie, fines don't come to the authority. We can get costs. Fines just go back into the criminal justice system to pay for prosecution costs. It's not as if we get compensation. So your answer to your question is whether they're fined or not is irrelevant with regard to our finances.
Well, wouldn't they stop doing it if they were fined?
Well, that's another issue, but it wouldn't pay for us to employ another enforcement officer. Anyway, can I come back to Vicky now, please? So I think I was right on that, Ed, wasn't I?
Spot on, Chair. Yeah.
Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I feel that the enforcement officers are doing a great job with the limited resources and with their hand pretty much tied. The report actually states that the basic principles are set by government legislation. So formal enforcement action is an evidence-led process with a burden of proof on the council, which I'm assuming, and I'm sure Ed and John will both correct me if I'm wrong, costs us money if we have to prove this, which obviously then leads to more cost to the council and so to the taxpayer. I also agree with Councillor Bailey that the conditions need to be tightened up at the planning level so that the limited powers that we have can be fully utilised. To have it a little bit, for want of a better phrase, and please don't take this as an insult, a little bit wishy-washy at the planning level where, you know, it will be done at some point isn't really very helpful. It needs to be, the works need to be completed fully, no matter what area you're in. From what I'm hearing from other people, Councillor Chapman, Councillor Bailey, etc., and I'm sure Dan will pick me up on a few of these things when he comes in shortly. You know, planning legislation is put there. We do as much as we possibly can. You know, we all know of places within our own patches where, you know, these big sites, they do what they have to do. They tell you exactly what they want you to hear to get it through planning in the first place. Then they do that lovely thing, you know, where they want to alter things slightly, which basically means they don't want to do what they originally said they'd do to get it through planning. And as far as I can work out, we don't actually have the teeth to be able to do a lot about that. You know, and it's not, for want of a better phrase, and I hate saying things like this, it's not fair. It's not fair on people like Ed, and it's not fair on the other enforcement officers who get all of us phoning them up complaining about it when their hands are tied. You know, they do as much as they possibly can, but if we can try as much as possible to get it in at a planning level where I don't even know what the wording would be, I'm sure somebody would be able to help with that, that, you know, we tighten up as much as possible so things cannot get signed off at our level until everything is put in place that should be put in place. You know, things as Councillor Chapman said just now, you know, with respect to, you know, if they have to cover up the lorries, etc., etc. I mean, I know of the site that Councillor Bailey was referring to earlier. We've all had it. It's all been done beautifully. People have bought their houses and moved in, and then they come and dig the roads up for a reason. Fair enough. It needs to be done for various reasons. And then they continually dig up the roads for various reasons. And people are left living on a building site again, which they didn't sign into, you know, and I know they're new houses, etc. But I don't know if there's anything we can do, is there, Ed or John, in respect of tightening up the original planning applications when they come in so that we can enforce, you know, all the way through to the end and give you a bit more teeth, for want of a better phrase, without actually, you know, going up to government itself and saying, oi, you know, you're wanting us to build all these houses, but you're not actually letting us do it in such a way that, you know, ties in with the residents of the areas that we live in and makes it actually a livable area. Anyway, that's my 2 pence worth.
I think you were referring that you thought Dan might be coming in to support you. So if Dan's got similar points, let him raise them, then Ed can answer them.
More like Dan will probably correct me.
Not at all. I just wanted to cover a few things if possible, Chair. We talk about a proactive approach at the start of the debate. I don't think that's at all realistic on the resources that we have or could get in the future. I think if you look at just the planning applications that were decided between January and March this year, it was 487, and that's just minor applications. If we were to extrapolate that across the year and assign a case to every officer to look into every application that's been completed, it's just not viable. it's not realistic. I think Ed will say for himself that if we were looking at additional resources, he would much prefer to fill the long-standing building control vacancy that we've got, or for additional planners to clear the backlog of the huge amounts of planning applications that we've been receiving recently, and probably more budget to actually get them validated from the external resource that we've contracted. I think that's where I would prefer Scrutiny to look into, to actually start recommending resources in other areas rather than this, which isn't quite there. You can see in the report we've got one of the highest in the Southwest for planning enforcement officers. You might be aware, but South Somerset doesn't have a single planning enforcement officer at all. So we are pretty well equipped in this area, and I think if we are looking for recommendations looking forward, what I would suggest to the Scrutiny Committee is firstly to allow it to continue to lobby on central government to impose these fines that we keep trying to push for. That's just a continuation of something that we're already doing. And then secondly to that is maybe introduce a how-to guide for Joe Public that we can direct members of the public to, rather than wasting so much officer time and resource in that where we are just referring them back, and that's zapping away the much needed resource. We can actually direct them to our website, which will have something that's comprehensive, answer a lot of questions, and then hopefully release a lot of resource so that we can actually drive that back into cases. Thanks very much, Chair.
I think we're almost saying the situation is as it is, and as the law is as it is, and where the encouragement is to encourage build. There's little we can do, and it's almost not worth spending resources on something which is going to have little impact. I also take the point that perhaps we should lobby through our MPs. The planning process currently is being under reviewed, and actually get some requirement in the planning law that makes developers play by the rules. Now, I don't know how we would achieve that, but a recommendation could be that we consult our MPs to take part in the consultation. You know, I know the situation is. I think the most useful suggestion was, and I don't know quite who suggested it, that all councillors be made aware of the contents of this document, not perhaps in so much detail, but the few points that Ed made about there's very little we can do, and warn our residents to be on their guard because they are our eyes and ears. That's not a recommendation. It's just accepting the status quo. Has anybody got any other great idea to come up with a suggestion to this problem? I don't think so. I see no hands.
Okay, you've got Councillor Bailey and Councillor Davey waiting.
Oh, sorry, you're coming back again. Sorry, Jess, I thought that was your hand was up from earlier.
No, sorry. I just wondered whether Ed could respond, and I do think there is a distinction between individual, enforcement matters and delivering infrastructure on large sites, and who's actually monitoring the timely delivery of that infrastructure, because actually it's very difficult for individual people to be the eyes and ears when often those documents are really, really complicated and really kind of inaccessible. So I just wondered if I could have a comment from Ed. Thank you.
Chair, did you want me to respond to that?
Yes, and also at the same time, if you could respond to what I said about, and I think it touches a bit on what Jess said, making some source easily available and understandable to our residents who have such a query, where they can be signposted to somewhere which will answer their questions and perhaps save you work.
Yes, I mean, certainly we can look at that. I mean, unfortunately, planning is a complicated area, thanks to the legislation. So trying to make it simple is difficult sometimes, particularly when it comes to large-scale sites, as Councillor Bailey and Councillor Johns have referred to in the delivery of infrastructure, because often the requirements are split between the conditions that people will perhaps more readily see on the decision notice and clauses in the Section 106 agreement. So, for example, in relation to an open space, you might have a condition requiring the details to be submitted, but then actually the requirements for actually providing it or paying for it to be provided might be in the Section 106 agreement, and you need to read the two documents together, which I'm hoping is the issue with the site Councillor Bailey was referring to earlier. But I will obviously look into that, but I'm confident that there is a provision that makes them deliver that that play area that she was referring to. So yes, I think there's an issue there. I'm not quite sure how we can make that information readily available to people moving into new developments as to what's coming forward when and what their expectations should be about that. I'd need to give some thought to that. That in itself could be quite resource intensive in itself. The information is all there on our website, but I appreciate some of these documents are impenetrable to Joe Public. So I'd need to take that away and give some thought to how we might go about doing that, but happy to look into that.
I'm anxious that this shouldn't go on. I've come back. Can I come back to the recommendations? We have considered the planning enforcement process. We've done that. And then the second thing is to make any recommendations for changes. I don't think, as things are at the moment, there's any change that we can recommend, bearing in mind what the current legislative structure and rules are, and then make any recommendations for changes to the resourcing of the planning enforcement service. From what Ed said, generally his planning enforcement resource is adequate, other than when people are away. So I don't like making recommendations that are meaningless. Is there a recommendation that I don't say like noting it, but
Councillor Parr has a hand up.
Yeah, I was just trying to tidy up my sentence, Helen, but was struggling. So please come forward.
Thank you. I would like to recommend that we lobby, well, first of all, that we circulate this report to all councillors, and that we ask that a simple to understand enforcement, or we check that our website has a simple to understand explanation of enforcement for the public to be able to at least go to in the first place. And also that we then lobby our MPs to give local authorities more teeth when it comes to enforcement. I don't know the detail of that, but that they look into the powers that local authorities have to enforce.
So that's basically his 3 recommendations. Have I got a seconder for those recommendations? Ollie, you're next. What have you got to say?
Well, it was really just to agree with what Dan said earlier, but we can't be proactive on every application. And going back to Ed's report, I don't think it would be particularly productive, because as Ed has pointed out, in a great deal of the cases investigated, they were either actually according with the permission over a quarter. In some cases, permission wasn't actually required for the activities they were carrying out, and in others, the activity was ceased when the officer went. So you could say that was an outcome of the officer visit. I think that's what activity ceased meant. In other cases where it was a retrospective application, then permission was subsequently granted. So going down, there was very little where there was actually a technical breach of the conditions or of planning legislation. Councillor Bailey's point about conditions, I think, in that particular case, maybe we, as planners on planning committee, we should have been alert to that and made sure that the condition actually specified that the play park would be delivered. But usually the first condition in any planning application is that it will be delivered in accordance with the plans that have been submitted. So if the play park was on there, I would imagine it will, as Ed has intimated, eventually be delivered. And as Ed has also suggested, may actually be covered by an S106 agreement. I don't think I've got a lot to add in terms of recommendations, other than to agree that this report is circulated to councillors, because I think we all feel frustration when things seem to be going wrong. And I'm sorry, I've got mayhem going on behind me. I've got grandchildren here, in some cases trees are felled and so on before the application goes in, and I think that is far greater cause for concern. Well, I turn off now before you're all deaf.
I don't want to drag this on any more. We did have a recommendation which wasn't seconded.
Shall we move on then, Chair?
I think we'll move.
Point of order.
I think we just say that we reckon.
Acknowledge the report, Chair. Acknowledge the report and its contents,
and recognise it, and recognise the situation that planning enforcement is, where their hands are very much tied by the current legislation.
Okay.
Everybody happy with that? Yeah.
Yeah, nods all round. Thank you, Chair.
That's all right then.
Do you
and
think
the last one is, I don't know if anybody's actually presenting the performance indicator of the report, the last item on the agenda, and I suggest that we recognise that and look forward to improvements in those areas that need improving. There's no recommendation there, it's just for us to note. So thank you very much. Is everybody happy with that?
No.
Councillor Parr has a hand up, Chair.
Sorry.
Thank you. I just want to ask, under working days lost due to sickness absent, it says a full absence report looking at short and long-term absence trends is due to be published in June. So this report's very out of date. I don't think we've had that June explanation for working days lost due to sickness. And I think that's absolutely vital that we do know about sickness and where is this report?
I think that might be explained by the fact that we haven't had the head of HR for some time, and I hope that that's something we can impress upon our new HR.
Help, Chair, could I?
Yeah.
Yeah, the report has been done. It was just an oversight that it wasn't put onto this agenda. So it is done. I've seen it. SMT Plus have seen it. It is ready. It was just literally an oversight that didn't go onto this agenda, but we can certainly bring it forward for the next agenda. So sorry, Council. Yeah.
So anything else? Are you happy with the recommendations, Anita, that we have made?
Yep, certainly, Chair. You've just got the scoping report on the end, I think, of the agenda.
Oh, I didn't. Oh.
or the, sorry, rather the proposal form to be as a request to be scoped.
Oh, so I'd overlook that. Is the committee happy for that to be scoped and looked at? Paul, do you want to speak on it?
Well, not for long, Chair, if you don't mind, but at the same time, obviously, if members would like me to, it's a very simple request for an officer to come back to this committee when they have a chance with their workload, to look into the implementation of the 2015 to 2019 playing pitch strategy. We're currently in the process of drafting a new one through our LED monitoring forum and our consultants. I think it would, from reading the 2015 one and all of the ambitions within it, I think it would be very useful for us as a committee to look at why certain ambitions weren't realised, so we can reflect on those when we're agreeing the next strategy. I hope it will be a simple report, and I hope that members will agree for this to be scoped. Thank you, Chair.
Val.
Thank you. So I fully support all the points made in this proposal. My concern is that I'm not sure, since we're writing a new local plan, it seems to me that this could be something that could be discussed at strategic planning about how we're going to do this better in future. It concerns me a little bit that we would need yet another TAF, given the workload of officers at the moment. And I think I was a little bit concerned about the TAF being held not in public, because actually I think it's something it's very important to the public, the playing field strategy, and therefore to have it discussed at strategic planning would allow that to be open and public. So I fully support everything in that proposal, except I think it should be looked at by strategic planning and not by a separate TAF.
And of course, the aims of the report to improve health and well-being is fundamental to our whole mission. So I tend to agree with you. Dan.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one from me. It was decided at the February Strategic Planning Committee the playing pitch strategy would be picked up when officer resources allowed. That's just because obviously the focus right now is on the local plan and the work would be completed. I think to further drag resources out of that process, be that for the local plan or the playing pitch strategy, you're just delaying both and you're taking valuable resources away from those two things, when realistically what would be better would be to allow it to go through the strategic planning process, act as a scrutiny function at the strategic planning committee, and feed into that as we will receive the draft and the full strategy through that committee. I don't feel that there is a need for a TAF for it, and you are all welcome to the strategic planning committee to speak whenever you like. So thank you very much.
Is the rest of the committee content that the strategic planning committee should pick this up? Can we just go to the formal bit then? If you agree with that, a tick.
Green tick if you agree. I guess the vote is that you won't proceed with this from a scrutiny point of view, so that you'll leave it to strategic planning to progress. So green tick if you agree, red cross if not, and electronic hand to abstain.
Thank you. I noticed that Paul actually agrees with that process. Thank you.
That's 7 in favour, 1 abstention, none against.
Well, that does finally bring this meeting to an end. I've got to apologise to everybody for it going on much longer than I would have wanted it to, but I thought it was very important that the initial matter, the report by Mark Williams, was fully discussed, and that took up a fair bit of time, but I thought it was right. Even the cat's interested. I thought it was right that everybody who wanted to have a say had a say. So thank you very much, and I will be much more time conscious next time we meet. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you.